Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, viewers. Welcome to the Economic Briefcase right here on Cabinet TV, not just another channel. Today, we have a very interesting topic for you and a very interesting guest in the studio who's going to help us dissect this topic and understand it better. And our topic for tonight is infrastructure, financing, and PPPs. And many are the times that we see that our national budget doesn't have the capacity to finance these infrastructure projects due to many budget constraints. This could be due to high debt levels, but there are other alternative ways of financing projects, as we know that infrastructure development is one of the key components in national economic development. And to help me discuss this topic tonight is a very interesting guest, as I've said, Malindi MSONI-CHATORA. I hope I pronounced the name correctly.
You did well.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
But before we go into the topic, let's look at the market update. Welcome once again to the Economic Briefcase. Malindi, you're welcome. Today we are discussing infrastructure, financing, and PPPs, that's public-private partnerships, and of course other alternative financing models that exist. So, could you tell us about yourself, Malindi MSONI-CHATORA, and the organization that you're representing?
Okay.
What they do. First, you can start telling us about yourself, then you can move to the organization you're representing, ZIPA, and what they do.
Okay. Thank you for having me here. So I'm Malindi MSONI-CHATORA. I'm an economist by training, and I'm working as a researcher at the Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research, ZIPA. So ZIPA is a think tank established by the government of the Republic of Zambia, and our core mandate is to conduct evidence-based research and policy analysis to inform decision making. And we do this across a number of themes. So the theme that I'm currently leading at ZIPA is on transport and infrastructure development. And we've been privileged to undertake a number of studies that are responding to different issues that we're facing in our transportation systems. We've done work on the Zambian aviation sector, which was instrumental in the development of the strategy on aviation. We've worked on issues of decongesting traffic. We've looked at issues surrounding TAZARA, and a common theme that always comes up with our work is once we've done the studies, we give the government a recommendation or different stakeholders. The issue that always comes up is, okay, how do we finance these different proposals that you've come up with? So the topic of infrastructure financing is very big and it's taken center stage in the debates that's been going on. And I think many of the viewers that are listening or watching right now have heard this time and again from our political leaders, even when the Minister of Finance was announcing the national budget, how do we finance our infrastructure? So I feel very privileged and honored to be given this platform to actually discuss issues around financing infrastructure and in particular PPPs.
Okay, so maybe before we dive into the most important parts of this topic, maybe we talk about the importance of infrastructure development in an economy, especially in a developing country like Zambia.
Yeah, excellent question. So we hear infrastructure development a lot in many...
Because we hear some people will say, no, too much infrastructure is bad, too less of it is...
Yeah, so you're right. I think it's important that we also broaden understanding on what is infrastructure development. So when we talk about infrastructure development, we're referring to the planning, the designing, the construction, the upgrading, maintenance of different physical structures. This could also be systems and networks. So particularly in the sector where I work, like in transportation, when we talk about infrastructure development, we're talking about the maintenance, upgrading, rehabilitation of things like roads and highways, railway infrastructure, ports, harbors, airports. In the energy sector, you will be talking about electricity generation plants. In the water and sanitation sector, you'll be talking about water treatment plants, drainage systems, sewer systems. ICT infrastructure, you also have issues of network infrastructure. So there are different types of infrastructure. Some are physical, some are what we call soft infrastructure. But basically, all these issues are very important for the well functioning of a society. So I can give a very practical example of someone who's running a small business. You need things like reliable electricity supply for your business. You need access to reliable transport systems. If you're selling goods, to get them from where you're ordering them, to bring them to your shop. For your customers to get to where you are, you need transportation. You obviously need water. You need ICT infrastructure for communication. So if you do not invest in infrastructure development, then your society doesn't function. It means even your businesses are suffering. And if your businesses are suffering, we are not growing as an economy, we are not progressing. And you know, when the economy is not doing well, even the social sector suffer.
And when we're talking about the sector that you are coming from, when it comes to trade, intercity trade, or even trading with our neighboring countries.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and when we talk about financing, infrastructure financing, there are basically different alternatives that exist. Mm-hmm. And many other times that the government doesn't have the capacity to deliver on all these infrastructure projects that are very important. And just as our topic indicates that we are to discuss PPPs, maybe we can start with that. Public-private partnerships, and what is a private-public partnership?
Okay. So I would like to start with the other side, where let's look at broadly infrastructure financing. Mm-hmm. So I've talked about what infrastructure development is, but there's this growing need to finance that development. So there are different ways that countries often do this. The most common way is to fund your infrastructure development through the national budget. So looking at revenues that you generate domestically from both tax and non-tax sources. We also get grants from multilateral or bilateral partners to finance our infrastructure development. But we also do that through loans, through equity, through debt. So that's one side. So you have the public sector investing in infrastructure development, but we can also have the private sector coming in to invest in infrastructure development, and they do this predominantly through borrowing from loans and debt. So now when we get the two together, the public sector entities and the private sector entities, to deliver an infrastructure project or service, then now we're talking about the term of PPPs, public-private partnerships. So it's just easier to think about it from the expression itself. So public-private partnership, you have the public sector coming together with a private entity to come up with some form of partnership. And I'm saying form of partnership because it can take so many forms to deliver a public good or service. So generally, that's what PPPs are. And as a country, we've historically relied on our national budget to fund infrastructure development. And much of the infrastructure development that has taken place in the last decade or beyond has been financed by debt. And we all know what that has resulted in. We've reached very unsustainable levels of debt, largely driven by infrastructure development. So, and I don't want to get into that topic of debt, but most people know exactly what's going on there.
Generally, when even personally, when you have so much debt, you go and seek more debt. Nobody will be able to give you that that financing that you need. So. Yeah. The only solution is to find other alternatives to that. When you look at PPPs, there might be a misconception, especially for people who don't really understand these partnerships between the government and the private sector. Some would say, what's the difference between this and privatization? Because you are talking about the private sector coming in collaboration with the government, and well, it could be running of a facility, building, design, and so on and so forth. What's the difference between these?
So with public-private partnerships, like I mentioned, they take many forms. We have types that just focus on, it's called a BOT, build, operate, and transfer. So you get a private entity to develop the infrastructure, operate it for a certain concession, so a certain period of time, and then transfer it to the government. So they take many forms. Others, the private sector might actually own and then lease to the government, or it might work the other way around. So PPPs, it's not the same as privatization. And they, I can understand why people often get confused, because it's such a complex topic. Even people in the economics fraternity sometimes do get confused with what PPPs are. But I think it's taking each case as it comes, because they can be very different for different projects across different sectors. So a PPP in the electricity sector might look different from a PPP in the road sector, for example. So I think understanding the differences is very key, and look at each partnership for what it is, and not broaden it, because the agreements can differ. Okay. Yeah.
And there are usually drawbacks. Of course, there are benefits. Well, actually, let's start by looking at the benefits, the advantages of using such a financing model. Then we can move to looking at the drawbacks on this.
So there are many benefits to entering into PPPs, and this topic is just not something that's being discussed in Zambia alone. Even in the sub-Saharan African region, a lot of countries are entering into PPPs, largely because we have such a huge infrastructure financing gap. I remember there's a study by the African Development Bank that estimated that African countries need on average around 90 billion per year for infrastructure development. So the number one benefit, obviously, is that it helps with financing the project, because you have a private sector entity who, you brought up the issue of if a country is constrained by debt, it might limit their potential to access additional debt. But with the private sector, they are more adept to getting financing from financial markets. So number one is that PPPs, because they're bringing the public sector and the private sector together, we're able to pool resources and at least lessen the financial burden on the public sector. There's also the aspect of bringing different expertise. We know from experience, from literature, that the private sector is usually more efficient in delivering infrastructure development projects, because they bring in the expertise, they usually have access to better technology and know-how. Of course, the public sector also has their own expertise, but bringing that together results in a pool of expertise which makes it more efficient to deliver a project. There's also the issue of risk sharing. As opposed to going in on their own, the government is able to share the risk of delivering these projects with the private sector. So, yeah, largely the benefits are around pooling of resources, a sharing of risks. If you look at the drawbacks, I mentioned, so these are very complex projects. They can span many, many years, some even longer than 50 years. So they have certain risks because of how long they are. So if you go into them, and from the public sector point of view is, if we don't understand properly the risks involved with certain projects, we might actually find ourselves exposing ourselves to more debt, because depending on the type of partnership it is, the public sector might also be required to put in some financial resources. And then there's also some types of PPPs that require some kind of revenue sharing mechanism. So you also have to look at, okay, when we get into a revenue sharing mechanism, are we actually losing a lot more revenue than the private sector is gaining? So there are all those drawbacks. So there's the risk of further exposure to financial risk. And you had brought up the issue of how do we protect the citizens. So also risks around whether is this an appropriate project.
Especially when it comes to, you know how the private sector is, we know that the private sector is concerned about making profits.
Yes,
they have to see the potential of the project and how much they are to gain from these projects. And these can go as far as, exploiting the citizens in terms of if there's a fee attached to that project, in order for them to gain or to have a return on their investment in a shortest possible time. Now, how are these supposed to be mitigated where now the private sector does not exploit the citizen?
Yeah, so it's a delicate balance, and you're right. The private sector is driven by profit, so whenever they are investing in anything, know that the motive is profit. So even as public sector entities that are going into these PPPs, they need to keep that in mind. That's why we need to sharpen on our capacities to actually understand these contracts that we're getting into. When we're talking about risk assessment, do we have the requisite skills for actually assessing risk from the public sector side? Are we able to forecast to see, okay, in the future, how will the demand for this particular service be, and how will that impact on the revenues that we expect? So things like that. And you are quite right, we need to protect the citizen. And in the road sector, for example, the roads that have been earmarked for development through PPPs, the private sector entities are looking at recouping their investment through road tolls. Now, in the strictest theory of tolling, road tolls, because they come from the theory of congestion pricing, is you're tolling to reduce on congestion. So you're ideally supposed to give an alternative route. So if you know I'm driving along British Road, for example, there's a road toll, I should have at least had an alternative. So the idea is to keep you away from that road. But the way it is now is, if a truck is moving from Chirundu to Nakonde, there's pretty much only one route, right? So they have to pay the tolls along that route, and it can get expensive, and that's why we need to balance that.
To me, it's sounding like you're suggesting a toll within a city, because only within a city are there alternative routes where. You say if you're going to, for example, from the CBD to Charleston, there are other alternative routes, but the shortest possible route is British Road. So you mean a toll on can that actually work? A toll get within a city?
Most cities actually use tolling for controlling congestion.
Okay.
Yeah. So most cities, even here in Africa, you can cite South Africa, they have toll gates on these roads that are running within the city. But usually the tolls that are on these trunk roads, the roads that are connecting us to other countries, for example, are usually for generating income for maintaining the road or expanding highways. And those are the ones where we need to be a bit more careful, because that's our business side of the economy. That's literally carrying our GDP. So we don't want to overburden the goods transportation market. And in studies that have looked at transportation costs, Zambia is cited as having actually higher prices because of the transportation cost component. So that can be shifted now to the end users, and you see that in higher prices. So we have to balance it. And the way the government tries to do this is where you hear that the concession period is longer. Because if you say no, let the concession period be within 5 years. For a private investor to recoup the investment, that means they have to charge a much higher toll or fee. So if you lengthen it, at least you're able to charge moderate fees over a long period of time, and that helps to cushion the impact on the users.
Okay, how about on the side of the government? Because we've talked about the side of the citizen, and when these projects are in their development stage, or even before development stage, where feasibility studies, the planning stage, there is so much that goes on to a level whereby one party in this partnership might not fully understand the risks that come with it. For example, if we're talking about the lifespan of a project, the economic life of a project, you find that if it's a build, operate, transfer, where the private sector builds, operates, then transfer it back to the government, you find that at the point of transferring it back to the government, the project has led to no value, or rather it's in a very bad state. Yeah. So what can be the comments about this, especially on the public
sector side?
Yes.
So like a common issue that has always been brought about when you talk about PPPs was the legal framework is weak, we need to strengthen it, we need to enhance it. And the government has actually advanced in that area because they're reviewing the 2009 PPP Act. There's actually a bill that's being considered by Parliament right now. And it tries to take care of some of those things around risk. One thing that they're trying also to do is to build capacity in the contracting authorities. So the contracting authorities are not necessarily central government. It could be government agencies. So building capacity in those agencies to also understand the processes. So when you talk about feasibility studies, maybe they don't necessarily have to conduct the feasibility studies themselves, but they must be able to interpret the results. When different risk scenarios are presented to them, do they understand those things? So there's that attempt to try and build that capacity. But there is still more that can be done. We really need to sharpen our understanding, especially of the contracting process, what we are getting into. Those things are talking about what happens now after a project is given back to the government. So put in place a maintenance strategy. Like those are things you can put in the contract. A transfer of knowledge from the private agency back to the public sector as they're taking this thing up. We've actually been looking at the PPP framework ourselves as ZIPA and one of our partners, and we had a visit to Kasumbalesa. And Kasumbalesa has now been handed back to the government. And one of the issues is that the ICT infrastructure that they were using, the intellectual property is still with the private sector, because the people that are operating it now are still struggling to understand it. So they always have to fall back on the private entity. So I think it's all about how you structure the partnership. Think ahead. Think beyond when this project is transferred back to the government. What will we need? Do we need maybe to start setting aside some funds? And I've seen they've put that in the new bill, the 2023 PPP bill, where I think they have plans to set up some kind of fund where they can be storing some resources. So those are some of the things you can be saving up for, to say maintenance beyond the concession period and other such things that will come up. So I think it's all about knowing what you're getting into, negotiating your contracts very well, having the requisite skills and understanding.
So you mentioned that there are different types of PPPs. Maybe we just mention a few. How many? Now maybe we can pick on 3 or 4 main ones, main types. Just a brief explanation on each type. So
there's the build, operate, and transfer, where the private entity comes in with the financing, the technical skills, they build whatever the infrastructure project, they operate it for a number of years, and then they transfer it back to the public entity. There's the build, lease, and transfer, where the private entity builds and then they lease it to the public sector entity and then transfer it after a number of years. The leasing can also happen the other way around. Like for example, East Park Mall was developed under a PPP arrangement. So UNZA as the contracting authority and then the private entity. So the private entity built them all, but they actually pay rentals.
I've been trying to, I really haven't looked into that one, but I've been trying to understand it. I'm actually interested to see the arrangement that's there between the investor of Zambia and is it the developer or?
Yeah, so I think it's more of a build, operate, transfer.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's also a lease component because they pay rentals to UNZA.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's initially supposed to run for a period of 25 years with a possible extension of another 25 years. So yeah, there's also the build, own, operate, transfer. So there are many types and they're quite a mouthful.
And some notable projects that have used some of these. Maybe, of course, you mentioned the UNZA, then the East Park. Then which other notable projects that have used that type of
Kasumbalesa, the border post, is also one, and it was also undertaken under a build, operate, transfer model. We also have the Iteji Hydro power plant, which is also developed under a PPP and also in the build, operate, transfer model. So we have, well, as of last year when we were doing the study, we had about over 26 projects in Zambia that have been developed or considered for development under PPPs. And I'm saying that because some have been cancelled along the way, some failed to reach financial closure, but the majority have been in the power, the electricity subsector. Yeah.
You are watching the Economic Briefcase on Cabinet TV. Cabinet TV, not just another channel. Our topic for today is infrastructure, financing, and PPPs, public-private partnerships. And with me in the studio is MALINDI MSONI-CHATORA from ZIPA. There's much talk that has been going on the Lusaka Ndola dual carriageway, and the parties involved there. You know, there's NAPSA and these other, and there's been a talk of who's going to finance the project. I don't know if you can give us an overview on how that project is structured at the moment, and which stage is it at the moment?
So the Lusaka Ndola dual carriageway is something that has been under discussion, I think, for a number of years, and for many reasons, because it connects us to the trading corridors in the northern part of the country, to DRC, to Tanzania. So it's a very critical, I think, part of our transport corridors, and right now we know it's in a very deplorable state. The physical infrastructure itself is in a bad state, and we've seen the outcomes of that. The accidents, terrible accidents reported almost every year. So just to emphasize that this is something that the government is really looking to develop, and they've said that in almost all their pronouncements. And without having sight of like the actual contracts, actual contractual issues that are involved, what I understand from looking at PPPs in general is that it's a partnership. So the private sector entity, the public sector entity coming together. The private sector might come in wholly financing the project, or they might finance part of it and the public sector might also finance part of it. But I know what you're referring to with this particular project. The issues have been around why is NAPSA financing it.
Yes.
So private sector entities, when they're getting into these partnerships, they can source for financing from anywhere. And we know NAPSA is a contributory scheme, right? We contribute to NAPSA. And we know that when they get that money, they often invest it. So they do provide loans as well for such infrastructure projects. So if the private sector entity that's interested in developing this road has approached NAPSA for funding, I don't think they're going outside what our broad understanding of the PPP is. They've sourced, it's like them walking to a commercial bank and applying for a loan, but they've decided we'll go to NAPSA because it also offers financing and we're getting financing for this.
So I've seen many arguments, especially on social media, where they say if NAPSA will fund the project, I don't know if they're funding it entirely or it's part. They're going to part fund the project. But a lot of people are saying if NAPSA, which is a public institution in this case, and is going to finance this project, then why not just take it up? Then why does not take it up and finance it and recoup their money without involving all these other parties that have been involved? Isn't the point of bringing in a private party to participate in this infrastructure project being the fact that they should come with financing?
You see, why we think of it like that is because the renewed interest in PPPs has come as a result of the fiscal challenges we are facing. So whenever people hear we're getting into a PPP, they're thinking, oh, they're coming with the financing. But I mentioned that PPPs, it's not just the financing, it's also the skills that the private sector entity is bringing to the project. But, I mean, I could be wrong, but when you say NAPSA is financing, it's different from saying NAPSA is providing the funding for that project. Like I said, I haven't looked at the actual contract, but I would think that they are lending this money to the private sector entity to deliver the project. So there are many reasons why NAPSA perhaps wouldn't take up this. They don't have the expertise perhaps to develop roads and things like that. So, but they have the funds because they collect money from people who work, and they have the obligation to invest that money, to represent for the money that they collect. So they can lend money for financing projects. But maybe it's confusing because when you say a statement like NAPSA is financing, it's like, oh, NAPSA is paying for this.
But I'm sure they cannot just finance without looking at the return on their investment.
Of course.
But it's quite understood. What are some of these sectors that have been neglected, actually, that can utilize such a financing model? Right. Apart from the roads that we've mentioned, especially in the case of Zambia.
Yeah. So with PPPs, it's a bit tricky because, like I mentioned, the private sector entities are coming in for profits. So they are only, and if you remember when the Minister of Finance was talking about PPPs when presenting the national budget, he said we can't use PPPs for everything because it's not everywhere where the private sector can charge a fee and recoup their investment. So I know they've been, although it's very limited, there've been some PPP projects in the education sector. I can't cite specific examples, but I know
there's been some schools.
Yes, yeah. So there again, you have to think about, okay, so how is the private sector getting back their investment? So
especially with free education.
Exactly, and those are social sectors. So in places like education, health, it's a bit more complex on how you would apply PPPs, but I know they've been applied there. I just can't cite specific examples. So mostly it works, for example, in the power sector because we pay for electricity. In the road sector, it will work in areas where we can put tolling booths and collect tolls. It might not work in the rural areas, for example, where traffic is very little, and may not make much sense to put a tolling gate in the rural area. And that's why the minister even said we still actually have to generate our own income to fund rural roads, for example, because we can't use PPPs. Yeah, so
as we come to the end of our program, what are some of the takeaways that you would actually note that people should take away from this, especially in understanding the public partnership?
Yeah. So I think to the people watching this program, I think always remind yourselves that PPPs entail the coming together of a public sector entity and a private sector entity, and that partnership can take many forms. Try to avoid always thinking about it in terms of financing, because there are other things that come with the PPP, such as technical skills and materials and all.
Specialized knowledge.
Yes, so there are many things that come into it other than just finance. It's a complex topic, I think one which you have to continue reading up on to actually understand. So we as a country somehow have no choice but to look to this model of financing infrastructure development because of the issues I spoke about of our fiscal challenges. It's a model that has worked very well here in Zambia, in other countries as well. So we are not starting from completely not having any knowledge. We've been using PPPs for over 20 years now, so it's not such a strange phenomenon for us as a country. So
and also considering that there is actually an amendment to the bill.
Yes, so the legal framework is being looked at, and the government has heard the concerns that stakeholders have raised, and they've tried to respond to a lot of those issues. And even when we were giving our submission to the Committee on Transport Works and Supply at National Assembly, we encouraged the government to take the legal framework as a living document, something that we should keep updating because of the many developments that are taking place. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's what I can say.
You've been watching the Economic Briefcase right here on Cabinet TV. I've been your host, Noah Njapao. Make sure to make a date next week as we discuss yet another interesting topic. Thank you for watching Cabinet TV. Cabinet TV, not just another channel. Bye-bye.